The four ships of the da Barbiano group of the Condottieri class would continue to be the product of the Franco-Italian naval rivalry we've discussed previously. Initially designed to be grandi esploratori, or large scouts, intended to counter the large destroyers that the French had built in the early 1920s, which were armed with 5.1-inch and 5.4-inch guns. Much like the heavy cruisers of the Trento class we've discussed in a previous video, these ships would be built with speed in mind and accompanied with an armament of 8 6-inch guns. Those two things would come at the cost of armor protection, being lightly armored and somewhat fragile vessels. This group would actually all end up being sunk during the course of World War II. Now, as we discussed in a previous video on the Trento class, there was a Franco-Italian naval rivalry during the interwar period, due to a number of factors, with the majority of the reason being that French and Italian interests differed. The French would divide their destroyers into two broad categories: larger contre-torpilliers, who were to scout and protect the battle fleet against enemy destroyers and light cruisers, and smaller torpilliers d'escadre, or fleet torpedo boats, being built primarily to harass the enemy's battle line with torpedoes. During the interwar period, they would build multiple classes of contre-torpilliers, such as Jaguar, Gepard, Les Fantasques, and Mogador classes of contre-torpilliers. Now, these destroyers would be akin to the idea of super destroyers discussed in the video on the Tribal class, causing quite the stir in naval circles around the world when they came into service. Now, you might ask why the French would want to build these classes of large destroyers. Well, in short, they were meant to help counter the Italian advantage in light cruisers that they had in the post-World War I period, which leads us full circle back to the Condottieri class of light cruisers, as the Italians did not fail to notice the initial classes of contre-torpilliers and felt that it was necessary to counter them with small and quite fast light cruisers. Now, to talk about some of the aspects of the ship, it's important to note that these ships would have a very high length-width ratio of 10.7, making them less than ideal vessels to be on when the weather is rough. Another interesting feature of these ships would be their bow. It was rather straight, and to quote from Mussolini's Navy, a reference guide to the Regia Marina in 1930 to 1945, quote, "The last major Italian warships to have a vestigial ram bow, and the forecastle extending to the base of the tower, that also housed the hangar for the two seaplanes. The catapult was mounted on the bow, as in the Trento and Zara classes, and this awkward arrangement severely limited aircraft operations, even in moderate weather, never mind in action." End quote. 3 out of the 4 ships of the class would be constructed by the same shipbuilding company and would look very similar, with the differences between the 3 being rather hard to determine. While the Giovanni dette Bandineri could be spotted easily among her sister ships, as she was built by a different company and because her funnels, whose prominent horizontal piping on 4 levels, was very distinctive and visible even at medium ranges, not to mention the extra enclosed bridge that was on the tower, which in general for the Bandineri, her construction was not up to par of the other ships of the class, and did not enjoy a good reputation with the sailors of the Regia Marina. Now, as for the design of the class, they displace 5,200 ton standard displacement, and anywhere from 7,800 tons to 8,050 tons full load. As for their machinery, they would have 6 boilers and 2 shafted gear turbines, which produce 95,000 shaft horsepower, giving the ships a 31 to 32 knot top speed. However, on trials, the ships would achieve a 38 to 42 knot top speed, with anywhere from 101,200 shaft horsepower to 123,000 shaft horsepower. The machinery arrangement was based fore to aft, with 2 boiler rooms and 2 boilers per room, followed by the starboard engine room, with the 5th and 6th boilers in the starboard engine room. That would affect the funnel design, with the fore funnel having a distinctive shape, and the aft funnel would be cylindrical. Now, as for the astonishing top speeds that surpassed 40 knots, operational speeds would be a lot slower at 31 to 32 knots full load displacement. As for their armament, they would have a main battery of 8 6-inch or 152mm 53 caliber guns, with 2 turrets forward and 2 aft, along with a secondary battery of 6 4.7-inch or 120mm guns and 3 twin mountings. Their anti-aircraft battery would consist of 20mm and machine guns, and would carry 2 quadruple torpedo launchers. The 3 4.7-inch twin mounts and torpedo tubes would be grouped amidships, along with having float planes and the capacity to lay mines. Now, when it comes to armor, like I previously mentioned, they would certainly not be the most heavily armored vessels, with a waterline thickness varying between 18 to 24 millimeters of armor, or essentially less than an inch, with 20 millimeters or 0.79 inches of main deck planing, and 23 millimeters or 0.93 inches of armor for the turrets. There would be 4 ships in this class, of which their names will be appearing on screen right now, because for the life of me, I cannot pronounce all 4 of these ships in a row without messing up. So this is what we're going to have to do. They would all be laid down through 1928 and being launched in 1930 and finally being complete in 1931 and 1932, depending on the ship. When the ships were completed in the early 1930s, in order to lighten the ship and improve the transverse stability, the tripod mast had two legs removed and it became a pole mast, with the lower hull being strengthened to avoid damages and leaks at those high speeds that the ships could get up to. These improvements would help the seakeeping, but again, quoting from Mussolini's Navy, quote, the seaworthiness and general robustness of the Condottieri Class light cruisers remained questionable throughout their service lives. Now, when it came to their service, like a number of interwar ships that we have discussed on this channel, ships of this class would serve in neutrality patrols off the Spanish coast while the Spanish Civil War was going on, along with some of the ships visiting foreign ports outside the Mediterranean. Now, when it came to their wartime service, like I mentioned, all four ships of this group would be sunk during the war, with the Bartolomeo Colleoni being damaged off Cape Spada, which is off the western coast of Crete, in July of 1940, by only 3 direct hits from HMS Sydney and was later torpedoed by accompanying destroyers. The Barbiano and D. Giussano would be sunk while making a supply mission to North Africa, loaded with barrels of gasoline, and were destroyed by the gunfire of 3 British destroyers and 1 Dutch vessel, which would include HMS Mallory and Seek of the Treble class, a favorite of the channel. Giovanni della Bandoneri would last slightly longer than her sister ships, being torpedoed in April of 1942 off the southern Tyrrhenian Sea by the British submarine HMS Urge, breaking in two and sinking rapidly with a heavy loss of life. Now, when it comes to the ships of this class, they obviously did not have a great service record with all of them being sunk, but I think it's fair in saying the fact that they are rather handsome looking ships, and in my opinion that kind of goes for most Reggio Marino vessels of this period. But I find the concept of this class of ships very interesting, as essentially they were a counter to a counter by the French Navy to try to close the distance and the advantage the Italians had in light cruisers post-World War I. Another thing that I thought of while writing the script was the distinction of large destroyers, super destroyers, flotilla leaders, and so on. As I continue to create content for this channel and learn more, I find the distinctions between those ships and some light cruisers to be an incredibly fascinating topic, which some I think blurring the lines and making it difficult to classify some. But of course there are distinctions, and I would love to hear you guys' thoughts on large destroyers and smaller light cruisers. Anyway, please remember to like and subscribe as it will help the channel to grow.